So here's a screenshot from the swfa.com website of the March 5 to 40 by 56. Here you can see the suggested retail price as SWFA sells it. I haven't mentioned this yet, but I thought now might be a good time to point out that March scopes are not mass produced. You'll notice that they're always on back order. So what happens is when you put your order in, the order gets sent directly to Daeon Optical in Japan, and they actually have somebody whose job is to build you your customized scope. So as soon as that order goes through, they take the specs you want, and a professional builds your scope, looks it over, makes sure everything is tip top, quality control is, that person who built its job. They pack it up, send it to SWFA, and SWFA would then get it to you. So the specs of the 5 to 40 are a little bit different than the smaller scopes I've reviewed so far, starting with the 34 millimeter body tube diameter. Now there's a common misconception that a bigger tube diameter will actually get a little more light into the scope, and that's not true. The purpose of a bigger tube diameter is to give your scope more adjustment range. And so here is a demonstration that I found on ARLD1.com that kind of shows what happens when you have a bigger tube diameter. When you adjust your turrets of your scope to make the image, the crosshair go up and down, and you're zeroing in on your target, what happens is the erector tube inside the scope is being pushed up and down by this screw and spring combination. And as you click up and down on the actual turrets, this erector tube is being bent up and down to adjust your crosshairs. And what happens is if you don't have a big enough tube diameter, you'll run out of adjustment range when this erector tube bottoms out or tops out on the scope. To get the clearest image, you want that erector tube to be straight through the middle of the scope. And you're going to get your best clarity and image at that point when you actually have your scope bottomed out towards the bottom or the top. You do sacrifice a little bit of the optical clarity. So now that we've established that the 34 millimeter tube diameter actually is to give the scope more adjustment range, let's take a look at the adjustment range. You'll notice that it's 22 mils of adjustment, and that equates to about 74 or 75 MOA. That's less than the 100 MOA adjustment of the 2.5 to 25 and the 200 adjustment in the 1 to 10. And that's because as your magnification increases, your actual adjustment range decreases. So what that means for air gunners is that if you're going to use this scope to shoot out to the 200-yard range, you're going to need some adjustable rings or some other way to add elevation into your system. 75 MOA will shoot out to around 150 yards without a problem, but past that, the loopy trajectory of an air rifle is going to meet its limits. One last thing I'd like to mention about the tube before I move on to other things is that the March 5 by 40 has a 4 millimeter thickness of the tube. Most all other scopes will have a 2 millimeter thick diameter tube. That's important for a couple reasons. One is it's going to make this scope extremely robust. I personally baby my scope, so it's probably not going to be a big deal to me. But more importantly, what it does is it makes the scope extremely thermal efficient. And what that means is that it's not going to be as sensitive to temperature changes as most other guns are going to be. As the temperature changes, the internals of your scope swell and shrink, and what that does is it causes shift in the adjustment range here. Basically meaning that at 0 degrees, you might your scope tape here might say that it's 50 yards away, but if the temperature changes and it's 100 degrees, it might say that it's 60 yards away, causing you to miss. That's just something that somebody who's choosing to use this gun for field target would take into account. The fact that it's got really good thermal efficiency is going to make it more suitable for ranging at different temperatures than most any other scope. The focus adjustment of the 5-40 is amazing, just like with all other March scopes. They claim it'll focus down to a 10-yard minimum, but what I found is that at 40x, it'll actually focus down to 8.3 yards minimum parallax. As you can see by my turret tape here, you can range within to the nearest yard up to, frankly, you can get within to the nearest yard probably up to about 60 yards. You can get, plus or minus 1 yard. It's really outstanding. Its ranging ability. From then, you're probably got about plus or minus 2 or 3 yards up to around 100. And then from there, you're going to be plus or minus maybe 10 yards. I should read 160. There's an error on there. How embarrassing. Up to around 200 yards. When shooting out to those distances, you wouldn't rely on the focus wheel to actually measure it at 200 yards. If you're 10 yards off at those distances, you're going to miss. So a laser range finder is still necessary out for great distances, but this is just as accurate as a range finder, frankly, up to about 60 yards. And it's more accurate actually at closer distances than the range finder is. The 5-40 is not a small scope. It comes in a little over 15 inches long, but despite it having excellent quality and durability, it actually comes in weighing less than 2 pounds, which is pretty impressive. So here you can see the scope on a compact Taipan Veteran. You can see that the size of the scope is basically too big for this gun. It sticks out past the end of the shroud about an inch. Okay. Compare that with the 2.5 to 25. You'll see that this compact scope is way more suitable size-wise. Basically, you can run it on a compact gun like this, but I add a Donnie FL moderator on the end of it, not because it needs it to make the gun more quiet, just because adding it to the end makes the scope not look stupid on the gun anymore. So like with all March scopes, the turrets are extremely positive. As I'm clicking from one to another, you don't really notice any slop. So then, of course, I'm trying to wiggle the turrets to try to, show you if there is any. And it's really tough to pick out and show on camera if there is or isn't any. It just doesn't feel like there's hardly any, not even the 1/8 of a click that I experienced on my other March scopes. Alright, so the target is now finally set up to where I've got it leveled. My gun is leveled. It's not going to blow down from the wind. Everything's set up. The horizontal lines on the target are all 1 milliradian of adjustment, so that means each 10 clicks should get me down to the next line. I've got it as close to that horizontal line as I can get it. My scope is currently at 1.6 on the elevation. So I'll adjust it, up to 2.6, and the crosshair should drop to the next line. Let's check it right now. Okay, that's 2.6. Where are we at? Looks good. Now let's go to 3.6. Right there. Check it. It's actually below the line a little bit. Wasn't it above the line a little bit before? 4.6 should be the next line. It's definitely under, so it's not quite exact. 5.6. Yeah, it's a little under. 6.6. even further under. 7.6. Definitely not quite. 8.6. 9.6. It's gone how many clicks too far? Let's look. 1, 2, I'll call that 2 clicks. Actually, and I forgot to dial it all the way back down to the 1.6 to make sure it's zeroed afterwards. Otherwise, it could be that the gun moved on me and I... 1.56 right there. Okay, let's take a look. Nope, see, it's right back where it started. So, yeah. Alright, now I had to move the target up to 50 yards. The 100 yards target was kind of down over a hill, so when I tipped it sideways, I couldn't get it to where I could see it. So now it should be 20 clicks per line for the windage adjustments. So 20 clicks should be, yeah, it looks like it's a little past it. 10, 20 clicks past it. If I go back 1 click and it's dead nuts on, looks like it is. So it's just exactly like the elevation, right? You get 80 clicks, you're going to be rich too. So if you're like me, you're thinking, wow, for that kind of money, I would expect, the turrets to track exactly at 0.1 mil per click. And all I can tell you is that if you do tests on even the most high dollar scopes, you're going to be disappointed. Very, very few are exactly perfect. In fact, during my last review, I posted a graphic that showed how many over $1,000 scopes that I've done this test with that didn't ace it. And looking back, that's not really fair because almost no scopes ace it. In fact, of all the scopes I've tested, only 2 have aced the test. The March 2.5 to 25 that we looked at last time, and surprisingly a $700 scope, an SWFA 3 to 15 by 42 was the other scope that totally aced this test. The bottom line is it isn't really a big deal because what you're going to do is you're going to take the exact adjustment range that your scope gives and you're going to input that into your ballistic calculator. So in this case, because each click was actually 0.1025, I go into my Straylock plus ballistics calculator and I'm going to change 0.1 to 0.1025 for both the vertical and windage. What I'm trying to show here is that it's crucial that you actually perform this test with any new scope that you're going to use for long range shooting. Otherwise, your adjustments are going to be wrong and you're going to wonder why you're missing. The reason I prefer MOA adjustment is because MOA allows finer adjustments than milliradians do. This red line is close to 4 MOA of distance at 100 yards, and an MOA scope will travel that distance in 16 clicks. It's about the same as 1 mil of adjustment that a milliradian scope will travel in 10 clicks. So what happens is basically 1 click in an MOA scope makes the reticle travel only 1/4 of an inch, whereas 1 click in a milliradian scope will make the reticle travel 0.36 inches. Okay, so you might be asking yourself, why the hell would he care? Well, my meticulous nature is such that when I'm zeroing a scope, I want it to be absolutely on zero. And often the case, especially with a milliradian scope, is you'll have the gun just about zeroed, but you'll notice that it's shooting slightly left every single time. So you'll adjust the turret over to the right one, and then you notice that it's shooting just slightly right every single time. And you're thinking to yourself, what I need here is a 1/2 of a click to zero it in perfectly. This rifle scope rather, does come in a 1/2 mil adjustment ratio. And I would highly recommend, if you're getting this scope for an air gun, you get the one that has 1/2 mil adjustments as opposed to, not 1/2 mil, 0.05 mil adjustments versus the 0.1 mil adjustment version. I'm considering sending this one into March to have it switched over to the 0.05 mil adjustment, just because I really like it to be a little bit more of a finer adjustment for those situations. MOA scopes tend to have that problem. They still have it, but slightly less often. They're just a finer adjustment. You don't run into those instances where you're kind of caught between clicks to have your guns zeroed in perfectly. Now, having said that, I actually am, for the most part, a mil versus MOA agnostic. I don't honestly really prefer one over the other. But what you'll find often occurs is that a scope manufacturer will offer 4 reticles in a scope, 2 for milliradian and 2 for MOA. What I'll always do is I'll pick whichever reticle I actually like the best, whether it's MOA or mil. The best example I can think of that is the SWFA fixed power scopes. They've got a mil quad scope and an MOA quad scope, and I prefer the MOA quad scope because it's got a fine aiming dot. I like scopes that have fine aiming dots. The mil quad actually has a crosshair. If you were to flip the reticles around in those scopes, if you were to have the mil quad that had a fine aiming dot, I'd pick the mil quad scope, regardless of the fineness of the turrets. It's how important that is to me. I like a fine aiming dot. Okay, this is what the reticle looks like at 5x. It's a useful crosshair at this point. I can still make out the little aiming dot. Okay, and then there are numbers, and they're far enough apart that you could still use those hash marks for actually holdovers. Only 1 through 9 on the bottom. Okay. Now the next marked spot on the scope is 6x. This is what 6x looks like. The next marked magnification is 8x. And that's what the reticle looks like. You can really start making out that aiming dot quite a bit better at 8x. The aiming dot part of the reticle is most useful, however, between 10 and 15x. That's where I really, really like the size of it. It's still a little too small for my taste here at 8x. Now let's zoom up to 10x. Now when you're looking at 10x, I don't know if the Tacticam's picking it up or not, but the aiming dot is nice and fine, yet everything else about the reticle, holdover marks are nice and sharp and easy. The next mark is the 15x, so there's going to be kind of a big jump there. And this is my favorite. You can still see all the holdover marks all the way from, from 1 down to 9.5, and then 10 at the top of that post on the bottom. I'm not a real fan of everything above the horizontal axis. I don't ever use any hold unders. In my opinion, if you need to use hold unders, it means you've got a crappy, or I don't want to say crappy, foolish zero for your scope. I'd like everything on the top hemisphere of the reticle to be clear, just so, clean up the view, make it more clean. Okay, next up we've got 20x. Okay, 25x is the next marking on the scope. Now you can only see about 6 mil of holdover on it. Next stop is 30. It's starting to look a little too big. I mean, aiming dots starts to seem a little bit too big for my taste here. It's still usable. I don't know. This is where you get nitpicky, and this is always the real drawback to a first focal plane scope, is that the reticle is going to change sizes, and you're going to find, a small range where it suits your taste the best. And the last spot here is 40x. You can still see, you've got 4 mil of holdover at 40x. So before I talk about image quality, here's my standard disclaimer. All the images you're going to see are filmed through a Tacticam, and the drawbacks to this are huge. The quality of the images you see are nowhere near as clear and crisp as what I see directly with my eyes through the scope. There's several reasons for that. One that I haven't talked about yet is the prism system of the Tacticam actually sends some of the light to the camera and some of the light through the eyepiece, so both images are actually degraded. Having said that, the amount of light that gets sent to the Tacticam is significantly less than what is sent to the eyepiece. It's still way clearer through the eyepiece, even filmed through the prisms, than what the Tacticam gets. Tack on that the Tacticam isn't really expert at judging, light and adjusting those types of things like a typical cell phone would do, and you're going to see aberration and fuzziness, and you're going to see just a lack of sharpness and detail, and colors are going to be slightly off. So describing the glass in the March 5x40 is actually pretty dang simple. It's almost flawless. I cannot find any evidence of chromatic aberration. It's crystal clear all the way up to 25, absolutely no fuzziness. It's about as perfect as you can get. The image does, as all scopes do, as you increase magnification, start to get a little bit dark around 40x. That's nothing that can be avoided, of course. But there is no tunneling, no distortion throughout the lens at any magnification. And perhaps the most crazy thing is this is March's second best quality of glass. They've got a level even better than this called the High Master glass, which I'll go into in more detail in my next video. Bottom line is, High Master glass is the best glass for a scope in the world. This glass is apparently a notch below that, but I've got to be honest, my 45-year-old eyes can't really tell a difference. You don't find any chromatic aberration. The fuzziness, if there is any, what you're really looking at is problems in the atmosphere. You're looking at mirage is causing it, or dust in the air. The moving air is making the image a little bit fuzzy. When the conditions are ideal, the image is flawless in this scope. So the only scope I've personally owned that is really even comparable to the 5x40 is the Delta Striker HD 5-50x56. I got sold on this scope by watching a glowing review on YouTube, and I don't know, basically I had smoke blown up my butt. The optical clarity just isn't there on this scope, and that's what I was hoping to find. Basically, the Delta starts getting soft around 20x, and it gets worse from there on the way up to 50x. And so the March is just worlds better in terms of clarity. I also found like an artifact on the reticle of the Delta Striker. It was one of those scopes where my disappointment can't really be over exaggerated, and I couldn't return it fast enough. So in summary, the March 5-40 is a darn near perfect scope. One of the problems is that it has been discontinued by March. It's been upgraded to the March PRS, which has high master glass, a wide angle eyepiece, upgraded turrets. Basically, the new March scope version of this scope is, in my opinion, the best scope currently available in the world today. You can still find The 5 to 40 on, scope forums like Sniper's Hide. I've seen them, sold recently for $2,100 to $2,300. Some of them with illumination at that price. At that price, this scope is truly a bargain.